Azor. Hey, good evening, everyone. So I thought tonight we'll look at a shaila to do with Hilchot Shabbat. The question was asked the following. There is a person who lives in Israel, or is currently placed in Israel, and they trade stocks. They trade stocks on the New York Stock Exchange. And the question that was asked was the following. There's a certain type of, I know very little about stocks, but apparently there's a certain type of trading called a limit trade order, something like that, whereby it's done, or seems to be done automatically. When the stock reaches a certain price, at that price, the instruction is given to either buy or sell. So the question is, this person is now sitting in Israel on Friday. They want to put this instruction in for the day's trading on Friday morning. Gets to Friday afternoon here in Israel. Is now income Shabbat. In New York, the majority of the day's trading is still going to take place on Friday. So can they put the order in on Friday morning for the work to be done, the malacha, whatever malacha may be involved, certainly buying or selling, making an acquisition, to be done in New York, where they are placed is in Israel, it's going to be on Shabbat. That's the question. So, and there's a number of interesting things that come out of it. So the first thing we'll look at is, let's take away the complications of this case for a moment. The question is, assuming that there is somebody making that sale or making that purchase on one's behalf, let's assume that person is a non-Jew. Take away the time zones difference and all of that, etc. Is there a situation, would it be permissible for one to have a non-Jew perform something which is a forbidden malacha on one's behalf? So the Gemara talks about many different cases and examples and parameters. One of the cases the Gemara brings is for in the Shulchan Aruch. If somebody wants to send a letter, somebody wants to deliver a letter, and you send it you give it to a non-Jewish postman. Okay, well, it depends. If you say, I need this letter to arrive at its destination by tomorrow, or in a certain way, given a certain time when it has to be done on Shabbat, so clearly you're making the person, you're asking them to work on Shabbat, to do the malacha on your behalf on Shabbat, that would be forbidden. If you give the person a job to, it's not in your house, it's not in your city, it's whatever it is, it's not going to be associated with you in any way, but you give them the job, you say, I need this letter delivered. I don't care when it gets delivered. It can be any time in the next 2 weeks, in the next month. And I'll pay you the fee for having done the job. Not based on the hours, not based on the time, whenever you want. I'm not asking you to do it on Shabbat. So then the person decides that it's his day off on Saturday. He's going to go and he's going to take it. But that's his business. That's not up to you. And that's the case in first parak of Gemara and Shabbat. That's the case brought in the Shulchan Aruch. Seems to be based on that. Bring back to our case would be problematic as a starting point, because if the trading is only taking place on this day, which is going to be Shabbat, then that's going to be forbidden as our default. The question is, does that really apply? And is that maybe there are certain leniencies in this case which can come along and help us? Yeah.
So first of all, it's all done by computers. Yeah.
Right? Well, about to get onto that. You're one step ahead of me.
Okay. The second thing is that you're putting in an order. It may not happen in Shabbat, it may happen 2 weeks from now. It's whenever the stock reaches that price. So you're not saying it should be done on Shabbos. It may be that, maybe 2 weeks before it should never happen.
Okay, so it could be. So it could be. Okay, so let's again. I don't know exactly the intricacies of how it works. Let's assume that the order was made for a specific day. So for that 24-hour period. Okay, but your first point is a very, very pertinent one, which is a lot of these things nowadays, you don't have anybody doing it on your behalf. This is all done automatically. This is done by computer. I think I had a question a couple of years ago. I don't remember now exactly the details. Somebody called me up. It was Erev Yom Kippur. It was in a bit of a frenzy. There was some transaction that was going to go through. They wanted to know, they were happy to say, if the answer was forbidden, then it would be fine. But they could make a lot of money if something went through the bank, and the bank would have been doing it on Yom Kippur. I don't remember now the details of the case. But there was also a consideration. Is there somebody going to be performing malacha on your behalf? Or is this just being done digitally, automatically? And these questions, by the way, are coming up more and more all the time. More of these processes are automated, more things being done by computers, by artificial intelligence. Another question where this comes up, which is very relevant, the whole discussion now, which is more of a moot point, but regarding using electricity on Shabbat. So you go back 70 years, and where a lot of the power stations were being operated manually, you had workers doing the coals and or whatever it was, benefiting from the potential Chilul Shabbat in order to use electricity, big shayla. Nowadays, again, there are still people that are machmir to use generators and such on Shabbat. It's less prevalent, but nowadays most things are automated, so you're not necessarily there are other leniencies as well. That's not our topic right now. But the point is, there is a difference between whether you have an individual actually going out and doing the work, performing malacha, whereas things happen by an automated process. So that's definitely one area and one ground for leniency. But there's something else here as well, which is fascinating. Which is, again, our question is not where you ask somebody to do something for you on Shabbat. But our situation is, it's Shabbat for you, but where this is taking place, it's not Shabbat, right? We're in two different time zones. And therefore the question is, can I have somebody doing something for me on my behalf when it's not Shabbat where they are, but for me it's Shabbat, for them it's not. Right? This comes up as well. These questions of time zones, one of the most common places regarding Pesach, and only Chametz, when people travel in different time zones, you have Chametz in one place, etc. Yeah.
More common here. Somebody starts Shabbos early, somebody doesn't.
Very good. So we're going to get, you're on the ball tonight. So we don't find, at least as far as I'm aware, we don't find in great detail in the classical poskim, in the Gemara and the Rishonim, this case of two different people in time zones. But we have the case where for two different people, and for one, it is Shabbat. For another one, it's not Shabbat. Why? Because one person brought in Shabbat early. One person came to the early minyan. One person came to late minyan. Obviously, we're talking in the summer. In the winter, there's no time, but it could be theoretically. So it's based on this. The Gemara says that if you have perot, you have an orchard, you have fruits which you want to go, which are outside of the city limits. We have a Tchum Shabbat, an area in which we're allowed to go up to 2,000 amot beyond the city limits. Beyond that is your Tchum Shabbat. You aren't allowed to go there. So let's say a person has fruit that are beyond the Tchum Shabbat, where he's not allowed to go on Shabbat. So it says, Reuven can say to Shimon, you go, right? My fruits are within your Tchum, and your fruits are within my Tchum. You go watch my fruits on Shabbat. I'll go watch yours. We can do that which is forbidden for one would be permitted for the other. That's what the case of the Gemara. It's a case of geographical location. But based on that, the Rashba says, therefore, if Reuven had brought in Shabbat early, he could ask Shimon to perform malacha on his behalf, because for Reuven it's Shabbat, but for Shimon it is not. It is not yet. Okay, so therein is a question. Meaning, if I say when it is Shabbat for a non-Jew who's not obligated, doesn't keep Shabbat at all, I'm not allowed to ask them to perform malacha for me, right? Why is it that I can ask a fellow Jew who hasn't yet brought in Shabbat? And there are three main answers that are given in the Achronim as to why this case would be allowed. Based on those answers, we'll go back to our case that we started off. So the first answer, the Magen Avraham says, the reason why, if you've brought in Shabbat early, you can ask somebody else to do malacha for you, is because you didn't have to bring in Shabbat yet. There was theoretically a way in which this could have been permitted for you. If you hadn't brought in Shabbat, it's Friday afternoon, it's not Shabbat, therefore it could have been that for you it's still not Shabbat, and therefore you are allowed to ask somebody else to do it. If we take that logic and go into our different time zones, it's not going to carry through.
You're asking that person before you took in Shabbat or after you took in, but they didn't take it yet?
Let's assume that was afterwards, that was after you've already accepted. Yeah. So that is the.
I don't understand what's the problem. If I'm in Israel now, I want somebody in America to buy me shoes, and I tell him, go and buy me shoes when it's Shabbat for me, but for him it's not Shabbat. So what's the problem? I don't understand.
Okay, it's a good question. It's a good point. But
he can do anything he wants. Okay, he can go buy me shoes. He can go to him. So what's the problem? It's not Shabbat for him.
Right, but if he's doing, the question is, if he's doing it on your behalf, and for you it's Shabbat.
What's the problem? It's not Shabbat for him.
If I ask a non-Jew to do malacha for me on Shabbat, it's not Shabbat for him. He doesn't keep Shabbat. He's not Jewish.
No, this is something else. This is because in the Torah it says that the Avdecha, Amatcha, Shomcha, they have to also not work. But to ask somebody in Alaska to do something which is Shabbat for me, he can do it. Why not?
Okay, maybe. Okay, yeah, fair. Maybe it's not illogical what you're saying. We'll come back to. Which is why that's definitely if he's just doing, he can do whatever he wants. The question is when it comes to me. Okay, so going back to the case of the Rashba. So answer number one, in terms of one person who's brought in Shabbat earlier, is that you didn't have to bring in Shabbat earlier. Feasibly, it could have theoretically still be permitted for you. Therefore, it could be permitted for somebody else. Answer number two, which is brought by the Levush. Levush says that when you bring in Shabbat early, what you have brought in, or what you have prohibited upon yourself, is for you to do malacha, not for anybody else. That's something else. But answer number three, which is brought by the Mishnah Berurah, many of the poskim bring this, and this is the most prevalent opinion, which is going back to what you said, which is that for this other person, intrinsically, it's not Shabbat. They haven't brought in Shabbat. The action is not forbidden for them to do. You'll say to me, what about the non-Jew? What about food for asking a non-Jew to do it? So the answer is that because a non-Jew is not obligated to keep Shabbat, it's irrelevant. Were he to be part of right now, the question is, were he to be part of the obligation of Shabbat, for him it would be forbidden as well. But for my friend who's not brought in Shabbat yet, he is commanded, he's within the realm of the laws of Shabbat. But since it's not yet Shabbat for him, there's no problem. We can ask him to do it. I'll just mention, there's also a very interesting shaila which the poskim discussed as a result of this sugya as well, which is, what if there is something which is a machloket poskim? What if there is a certain action which some poskim permit to do on Shabbat, and some poskim say is forbidden, and some say is forbidden? So can I, if I hold that this is a chumrah, or maybe it's something which Ashkenazim can do, but Sfardim can't do, probably the other way around, saying Sfardim can do, Ashkenazim can't do, whatever it is, can I, on Shabbat, ask somebody for whom they hold that this is mutar to do something for me, which I hold is asur? That's a whole separate discussion. I'm not going to get into it, but I'll let you think about it. But bringing it back to our case, certainly based on the last reason that we saw, we go back to the original case. The stock market, yes, for somebody who's out there in a different part of the world, but for them, it's not Shabbat at all. What are they doing? What are they doing wrong? And therefore, there is great grounds to permit this. I will mention there is a Rabbi Kenigsberg. Rabbi Kenigsberg has a tremendous chumrah on this. Rabbi Kenigsberg has a shut where he says that for a kinyan, for a transaction to take place, affecting your possessions, for that kinyan to take place on Shabbat, for it to take effect on Shabbat, if it's relating to your possessions, that would be forbidden, even if you've put everything into place that needs to be arranged from before Shabbat. That opinion exists. It's a tremendous chumrah of Rabbi Kenigsberg. Most other poskim reject it, do not accept it to that degree, and therefore, again, going back to our case, the bottom line, the answer was that it was mutar. In fact, in the tshuva, it's actually brought at the end. It says, thought experiment. What if somebody owns a bakery? We're talking about selling stocks. What if somebody owns a bakery? Let's say somebody owns a bakery in New York, and one day they go on holiday to Israel, and they're sitting in Israel on it's now Shabbat. Are we going to say the bakery this week has to close 7 hours early? So it's not going to be selling on Yom Ha'af on Shabbat. We've never found such a chumrah. We don't find that the poskim write that, and therefore it seems to be the logic would apply also there and also by the stocks as well. Rabbi Hanania ben Akasha,